All right, we're looking at a whole new sermon series coming up, and this is an introduction to it right here. And we're going to start to see the picture unfold before us as John 21, 12 to 14 says this for us. And Jesus says to them, now Jesus has been resurrected. He's been resurrected for a number of weeks now. And he comes and meets with the disciples. And Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and he took bread and gave it to them, and he did the same with the fish. And this was now the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And here's what we have in the story is Jesus meets his disciples and his followers on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And he has a conversation with Peter, and that's what we're going to be looking at. This conversation with Peter. And first we need to understand Peter's life as we even begin at this. And I think I heard a song again this week by John Foreman had written this. It's called Learning to Breathe. And here's part of the lines in it. He says, hello, good morning, how you been? Yesterday left my head kicked in. I never thought I could fall like that. I never thought I could hurt this bad. But I'm learning to breathe, and I'm learning to crawl. And I'm learning that you and you alone can break my fall. And I'm living again, awake and alive. And I just am dying to breathe in these beautiful, abundant skies. And the idea behind that is no matter what happens within our lives that seems crushing, new life flows out. New life found in Jesus. So as we begin today, to begin to understand what was happening in Peter's life, I'm just going to throw some statements out there. And as I throw these statements out there, you can, if you want to, join with me and participate. And you can say, oh yeah, I've been there, done that. That's part of me. Or maybe right now, this is what's happened in my life. You don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to. But it's just a chance to participate and say, yeah, here it is before us. So here's some of the statements I've written out. Number one, sometimes things don't turn out the way you thought they were going to turn out. Sometimes life throws you a curveball for which you were unprepared and everything is just different. Sometimes under pressure, you do things you never dreamed you would do. Sometimes it feels like your world is just coming apart at the seams. Sometimes a conversation with Jesus changes everything. Hopefully we can all raise our hands for that one soon. See, such was the life of Peter. Everything for Peter looked like it was upside down. It looked like it was falling apart. It looked like literally it was crumbling underneath of his feet. See, Peter was feeling lost. He was feeling guilty. He was feeling disillusioned with everything that was happening. And these things, Peter understood things were different than he had imagined, different than he wanted them to be. And yet with this conversation with Jesus, he found out it's okay. Things are going to be okay. Just one conversation with Jesus changed everything. In the midst of feeling lost, Jesus offered really forgiveness. Jesus offered a renewed relationship. He offered renewed love. He offered renewed stability in his life. He offered new direction for where his life was going to be going. He offered new peace, new hope, new strength for the journey. And the journey was going to be tough. The journey was going to be hard. The journey was still going to be painful. And literally, he offers new and renewed vision for life. Anybody maybe use that today in any aspects of our lives? See, sometimes when things look like they're falling apart, they're really falling into place. I know our prayer when things start going crazy is, God, change this, make it better. God, make it back the way it was. God, make it to the way I want it to be. But sometimes we simply have to let go of what we want it to be and accept what it is. And that's hard, is it not? But we have to recognize that God walks with us and sustains us in the midst of that no matter what. Sometimes we have to let go of what is not God's plan so that we can get a hold of what is God's plan. And that's hard for us sometimes because we don't get to see the full picture, do we? We don't see the ending of it all the time. All we see is what's right here in front of us. And right here is in front of us is hard and it's painful and it's not what we want it to be, and we feel disillusioned and angry and everything else. It's hard for us to trust and say, okay, God, I'm willing to follow wherever you're going to lead. See, for the next 7 weeks, we're going to look at this, maybe the most famous conversation in the Bible, and probably one of the most important. And I got this from Dr. Stephen Seamands, and he was one of my teachers in seminary. And you'd show up to class, and you'd make it to class. It's either 2 or 3 days out of the week, whatever the schedule was. And he would take the first 15 minutes or so of class, and he would just talk about this thing right here that we're going to talk about, this conversation with Jesus. And I remembered it was profound and life-changing as I sat there in his class, and I couldn't wait to get to his class. And his class was really, I think, one of the classes I didn't really want to take. It was kind of one of those boring classes, like you had studying the discipline of the Methodist Church or something. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe. But I couldn't wait to get there. Why? Because of this right here, what he talked about. And then he wrote a book about it, and I was like, and I said, this is going to be a sermon series. We're going to put this together, and we're going to do something with this. Because as Dr. Stephen Seamands put in that book, and I truly believe this, I believe John is literally inviting us into this conversation between Peter and Jesus. Because it gives us some basic truths about faith and about life and about ministry. And I say ministry because everybody ready for this? Everybody listening? Here we are. When every person decides to make a commitment to follow Jesus, you know what you become? A minister. Did you know that? Everyone. A minister. Everyone. A minister. And as we join in this conversation, we get to answer some of Jesus' questions that he throws out there. We get to allow these statements Jesus makes to penetrate deeply into our hearts and hopefully to change us. I hope you're all ready for this conversation with Jesus, because it can and will be life-changing if we allow it to. But even to begin to understand and see the full impact of this conversation, we need to go back and look at Peter's relationship with Jesus and some earlier conversations that he had with Jesus. And that's where we're going to begin today as an introduction. See, the first conversation that was really important is Luke 5, verses 1 through 11. Jesus has a crowd that's following him, and he's trying to teach them. And what he does is he's on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he jumps into Peter's boat, and he says, Peter, push me out away from shore so I can teach these people. And he does so, and he pushes him out there, and he teaches the people. And afterwards, Jesus says, hey, Peter, how'd you do last night fishing? He says, I fished all night, didn't catch one fish. He's like, here's what you do. Go out there into a little bit deeper water and drop your nets and see what happens. And he does so. And there's so many fish that it's tearing the nets, they can't even get them all brought in. There's this miraculous catch of fish. And Peter just begins to understand who Jesus is and all that Jesus is. And they finally get the fish on shore, and they get the boats up there. And Peter falls on his knees, and he says, Jesus, just leave me. I'm a sinful man. Just go. You're here, and I'm here. And Jesus says, it's okay. In fact, the words that he uses is, Peter, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. From now on, I'm going to make you a fisher of people. And he calls Peter and James and John, and they choose that day to follow Jesus. It's a life-changing choice to follow Jesus. And they left everything. They left their nets. They left their boats. They left their enterprise. They left their business. They left everything to follow Jesus. But that's the first step every time, is we have to choose to follow Jesus. See, Peter's joining into this group, and he's setting out on what I would call the adventure of a lifetime. They know Jesus is the Messiah. He's going to change the world. They can't wait for the things that are going to be taking place. And he's going to be right there in the midst of it. All those dreams, all those great thoughts, those aspirations. There's going to be this kingly throne for Jesus. And man, the very rule of God's going to be right here. We're right in the midst of it. Can you imagine the thoughts and visions of grandeur for all them as they're ready to start this thing? Woo-hoo, we are moving forward, right? This is good stuff. We're following Jesus. There's a second conversation halfway through Jesus' ministry, probably a year and a half, 2 years into this thing. Luke 9:18-23. Jesus goes off by himself and he prays. And I'm sure what's happening is that God the Father is revealing to Jesus, he's saying, it's time for you now to disclose the truth of who you are as far as the Messiah, to reveal your true identity. So Jesus comes back from this time of prayer. He goes right to his disciples. He says, who do people say that I am? Oh, you're a prophet. You're Elijah. Blah, 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 blah. They give all these answers. And then he says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answers, you're the Christ. You're the Messiah, the Son of God. He says, yes, Peter. Yes, you got this. This didn't just come from yourself. This came from God himself. He's revealed this to you. And I imagine they thought, man, this is good stuff. Peter says, yes, you are the Messiah. And they're giving some high fives to him because he got the answer right. It was all good, right? And Jesus goes on, though, in this conversation, which is kind of interesting. He says, now let me go a little deeper and begin to explain to you the very nature and role of the Messiah. You see, the Messiah is going to be a suffering, bleeding, dying Messiah, but in 3 days I'll be raised back to the dead. Can you imagine Peter's giving a high five? He's like, dying Messiah? What the? That's not what I learned about a Messiah. What? I don't know about this. I'm guessing, maybe, Peter and the others get a little concerned, a little bewildered, a little disillusioned by what they're hearing here. And then Jesus, he gets to say right after that, he says, and you know what? If you're going to be my follower, guess what? You get to take up your cross too. We're following you, Jesus. We trust you, but man, we don't like this dying talk stuff. Third conversation. Luke 22:33. It's the Last Supper. This is the day before, and really the night before Jesus dies. And at the Last Supper, a dispute arises about who is the greatest disciple in the kingdom of God. Isn't that a great thing that have happen? So Jesus begins to teach again about serving, about being the least. If you truly want to be a leader, you got to serve. And this is what it is about loving and being there for people. And Jesus looks over at Peter and he says this. He says, Peter, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. But I've prayed for you. And I prayed for your faith that you will not fail. And after you have stumbled and you come back and you turn back, you need to learn to strengthen your brothers. And of course, Peter, I don't even think that even begins to register for him, because he replies back to Jesus, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison. In fact, I'm ready to go with you to the death. And Jesus looks at him and says, Peter, before the night's over, you're going to deny me 3 times. And from within a few hours, he goes from, I'm going with you to the death, Jesus, to denying Jesus completely, saying, I don't know that person. In fact, one of the translations says, literally, he's calling down curses upon himself if he knew that man. Wow, what a turnaround, huh? It's amazing how these things work. And we know that Peter does deny Jesus. In fact, one of the Gospels tells us that he locks eyes with Jesus after he denies him that 3rd time, and Jesus just looks at him, and that he leaves weeping bitterly. Now, I'm imagining that those were some long, hard days and nights for Peter right after that. What do you think? He feels guilty, regret, pain. There's this thing called the cross. Jesus dies. The enterprise is gone. They're hiding behind locked doors. And then, well, at least we know one thing happened. There's this thing called Easter that shows up 3 days later. And Jesus, boom, he's back alive. At least we know Jesus is back alive. But and they've seen him and they've talked to him. But Peter's never really had that chance to talk with Jesus again. Have you ever had one of those times in your life where you just need to sit down and have a heart-to-heart with someone because something happened between you that you just need to talk about? And he's just not had that chance to sit down with Jesus yet. When is this going to happen? When can this happen? Have you ever let down somebody you loved before? You ever let down Jesus before? It's okay. We're going to see in this conversation that Jesus has with Peter that Jesus is not only forgiving, but he's welcoming and he's loving and he's inviting Peter back in, not only to just a whole new relationship again, but not just to the way things were, but to what things could even be better than what they were before. more than they were before. Even though it's not going to be easy, it's going to be different, it's going to be painful, but it still has to happen. So now it's our story. Here we are, John 21. See, the resurrected Jesus meets the disciples on the shore, and he has breakfast with them, and we find out it's the third time that he's met with the disciples now after his resurrection. You know, it's interesting, we didn't read this, but another thing happens here. There's this miraculous catch of fish. You see, Jesus calls out and says, hey, how'd the fishing go? And they said, we were out here all night, didn't catch a fish. Does that sound familiar from another story just a minute ago? He says, hey, why don't you throw the nets down over here and maybe you'll catch some. And of course, they got to be thinking, yeah, right. But they throw the nets down and all of a sudden there's this huge miraculous catch of fish. And Peter, he begins to realize this is Jesus, man. He had his outer coat off. He grabs it, wraps around himself, dives in the water, heads to the shore. He's going to find Jesus there. And Jesus calls Peter over to himself to have this conversation, one that needed to happen. See, it needed to happen for Peter's sake. Peter's broken. I imagine he's more than likely just tired. He's lost his perspective. He's disheartened. He's disillusioned. I mean, he remembers that call by the Sea of Galilee, committing to follow Jesus. But man, this thing's a big mess now. It's nothing like I thought it was going to be. Sure, Jesus is alive, but it's not the same. I mean, there's no throne. We didn't conquer Israel. You know, we're still a bunch of ragtag people, fishermen and the like, kind of wandering aimlessly because our leader only shows up every once in a great while to meet with us. We don't even know what we're doing or where we are. See, I didn't think it was going to turn out this way. This isn't what I signed up for. What's next? Anyone ever felt that way in your life? Visions of grandeur have turned into this kind of messy situation. And I'm sure Peter's feeling a little lost and a little bitter and a little upset with God as to how things are turning out, but it's okay. See, I want you to know that God knows what we're feeling. God knows how we feel, what we're thinking. So if we're upset, the best thing we can do is be honest and have a conversation with Jesus, because it's going to be the best thing for us. And if you knew how many times I've talked with God and said, this is not what I signed up for. Seriously. This is a mess. I don't even know what to do with this. How many times I would say, God, are you even paying attention down here to all this stuff going on? Because I don't feel like it. My job, God, what is going on? My marriage, this relationship, my child, this sickness, this injury, this illness, this financial burden. I don't know how we're going to get this problem, this situation, God. It just surrounds me. If anybody has a time like that today, you know what? It's the perfect time to have a conversation with Jesus. The perfect time. Because we're going to see in this conversation that Jesus has with Peter that God is present in the midst of it. God has a plan. It may look different than what we thought it should be. It's going to be different. It might even be more painful. It might be messier. It might be harder. It might be what we really don't want. But it's still the wonderful plan in our lives and what God has for us. Because I think God sometimes tells us that things may look a little messy, but I'm at work in your life. And I'm simply asking you to keep your relationship with me close and to remain faithful. Just trust and follow. And we're going to move through this. I think there might be one more thing eating at Peter. He probably feels like a failure. He's failed himself. He's failed Jesus. He's failed the whole enterprise. He's failed all the others. I mean, he's just failed. I mean, is there any place for him anymore? Could he be of any use to Jesus anymore in the midst of this? And yet after breakfast, Jesus has this conversation with Peter. He doesn't shame him. Oh, I knew you were going to do this. He's not angry at him. I can't believe you would hurt me this way. He doesn't come with condemnation. He just comes with, are you ready for this? Love. He just loves him. It's almost like Jesus understands that life can get hard and life can get messy. And when we can't see the full picture of everything, it just gets confusing for us. And yet Jesus just comes with love. And he restores Peter as a disciple, as a follower, as a friend, and as a loved one. So he was on the Sea of Galilee where Jesus first called Peter. And now here again he recalls Peter. It's a word we know as redemption. He renews Peter's and restores Peter's not only relationship with him, but his passion for life and ministry and work. And God's plan is coming together even though Peter doesn't see it. And Jesus reassures Peter that he still has a place in this plan and that it's an incredibly important place. But it's time for Peter to recapture his love for Jesus. It's time for Peter to recapture his place again in Jesus' plan. Although it looks like it's fallen apart, God's in control and working things out for the good. So I know that sometimes life hits us heavy and we begin to forget what's important. I know there are times where we just get tired and worn down, and I think we get lost and disillusioned, and we feel like we're wandering aimlessly. But like Peter, as our world begins to feel like it's falling apart, with one conversation with Jesus, he can so lovingly remind us of those essentials of life. It's about a relationship with me. It's about being obedient and faithfully following where I ask you to go and doing the things I've asked you to do. And I believe in the midst of this, Jesus fully became again for Peter the way, the truth, and the life. He gave Peter stability. He gave Peter direction. He gave Peter hope. He gives Peter strength. And he gave Peter renewed vision. And so today, as we're going to sing our final song, I want you to find these things that you need as we begin to commit to join in this conversation. And I want us to simply take a moment to open this conversation with Jesus. And I don't know, some of you might be saying, I've just got introduced to Jesus. I don't know much about him. That's okay. I've known Jesus for 70 years. That's great. Wherever you are, I want you to take the next couple of minutes and just begin this conversation with Jesus, because I have a feeling every one of us have these places in our lives where, wow. And I mean, some of them, we're going to get into some of these things, and they're pretty deep as to why we avoid a relationship with Jesus and some of the things going on in our lives and the things that have happened and all that. But it's about opening ourselves up and saying, okay, Jesus, here's where my heart is. Here's how I'm feeling. And begin to listen. Okay, this is what you're speaking to me. So if you take the next minute or two and do that, and the band's going to come forward, we're going to sing a final song, and it'll be our prayer for where we're going to end.